For most of my childhood, the rules in our house weren't written anywhere, but everyone understood them. My brother Daniel was the future. I was reliable. Daniel had the photos on the wall, football uniforms, trophies balanced on the fireplace. My dad standing beside him with that tight, proud smile he rarely used anywhere else. When relatives visited, those stories came out easily. My role was quieter. If something broke, I fixed it. If bills needed organizing, I helped Mom. If Daniel got into trouble, someone needed to smooth it over. I didn't resent it at first. Kids normalize whatever world they grow up in. It wasn't until adulthood that I realized the hierarchy never actually ended. It just followed us. The job came up unexpectedly, a regional operations position at a logistics company that had recently expanded into our area. I'd been working in the field for 12 years, slowly moving up through companies that rarely noticed anyone until they'd proven themselves 3 times over. The interview process was long, exhausting. But when they called with the offer, it felt like something I had actually earned. Then my brother called. He had applied too, except he hadn't mentioned it. Apparently he assumed the position would come through one of Dad's old business connections. In his mind, it had already been decided. When I told him I'd accepted the offer, the line went quiet. The silence stretched long enough that I remember checking my phone to make sure the call hadn't dropped. A few days later, my dad called. He didn't yell. He just asked one question. Why would you go after something your brother needed? Needed, not wanted. Needed. I remember staring at the wall during that conversation, trying to understand how a job I applied for through a normal process had somehow become theft. That was when I called a lawyer. Not because I expected a lawsuit. Because the tension had started leaking into things that made me uneasy. Strange late-night messages, comments about people knowing their place. Nothing explicit, but enough to make someone cautious. The lawyer listened for about 20 minutes. Then he said something simple. If things escalate, document everything. I didn't think I'd actually need to. 2 weeks later we had a small family get-together at my parents' house. Barbecue in the driveway, kids running around with chalk and plastic scooters. The kind of gathering where everyone pretends nothing complicated exists. My daughter was drawing flowers on the concrete when my dad pulled up. He barely looked at me when he stepped out of his truck. The conversation stayed polite for maybe 15 minutes. Then my brother mentioned the new job. The temperature changed in the way rooms sometimes do when no one is technically arguing, but something heavier moves into the air. Dad stood there for a moment. Then he walked past everyone toward the driveway. At first I thought he was just getting something from his truck. Instead, he reached into the back and pulled out a crowbar. I remember the sound more than the motion. Glass doesn't shatter the way it does in movies. It collapses inward with this sharp, hollow crack that makes your stomach drop before your brain catches up. My car window burst across the front seat. My kids stopped moving. No one spoke. Dad lifted the bar again and slammed it into the door frame, denting the metal. Then he turned. He looked straight at me, not angry. Just completely certain. That's what you deserve. For a second I thought I might explode. Years of small humiliations, comparisons, being treated like the extra piece in someone else's story. But the strange thing was the anger never arrived the way I expected. Instead I felt something colder. Final. I took my daughter's hand. Let's go inside. I told the kids. They followed me without questions. Behind us, I could feel my father waiting for something, shouting, accusations, maybe even a fight. When none of that came, the silence stretched long enough to become uncomfortable. 3 days later my father received a letter, not from me. From my attorney. Inside was a copy of the recording from that afternoon. My phone had been in my pocket the whole time, exactly the way my lawyer had suggested weeks earlier when things first started feeling unstable. The audio was clear. The crowbar hitting the glass, my father's voice. That's what you deserve. The letter itself was calm, professional. It outlined property damage, the presence of minor children, and witness statements from neighbors who had watched from their porches. At the bottom was a simple request for reimbursement for the vehicle repairs. It also stated that any further incidents would be handled formally through civil channels. No threats, just documentation. Authority had entered the conversation, and once it does, things change. My father never called to argue. He mailed a check, no note, no apology, just the exact amount listed in the repair estimate. Since then, family gatherings have become shorter, quieter. Dad no longer shows up at my house unannounced. My brother stopped making the occasional jokes about how I stole the job. None of it was dramatic. There was no big confrontation where anyone admitted what had been wrong all those years. But something fundamental shifted. For the first time in my life, the rules that governed our family weren't controlled entirely by my father's expectations. They had boundaries now, not emotional ones, real ones, the kind backed by consequences. The window on my car was replaced within a week. The kids eventually stopped asking why Grandpa had been so angry that day. Sometimes I still think about that moment in the driveway, the crowbar, the glass, the certainty in his voice. He thought he was reminding me where I stood. Instead, he ended up showing me exactly where the line needed to be drawn. And once that line existed, something strange happened. I didn't feel like the second son anymore. Just a man who finally stopped absorbing the damage.